Now, if you already haven't figured out, I have an extreme passion for whitetail habitat, wildlife, making habitat improvements, hunting mature bucks, the strategy of it all, how it all relates to each other. And my goal for this channel is to actually teach. If I'm not teaching, if you guys aren't getting it or appreciating the information, then it's all for naught. And one of the things that I want to make sure that I do, and when I go around to my clients, this is what we spend half the day on, is making sure that you're not making mistakes as it relates to your whitetail habitat and deer improvements on your land. You're not wasting time, you're not wasting your resources of money and time. And that's truly one of my number one goals. I feel extremely blessed and lucky to be able to do what I do. I mean, we're out here today shooting videos. It's a little chilly, but we're driving the countryside. We had some eagles hitting a deer back here in the background where there's a road kill, probably a deer kill, whatever it is. And the eagles are back there. I had some young eagles and they're flying around. I mean, just beautiful. And this is what we love. We all love this kind of stuff. That's why you're watching. And I want to help you. I want to make sure that you're not making mistakes. And you know, a lot of these mistakes would have taken decades for me to learn on my own. But I have the luxury of visiting hundreds of parcels throughout the last 13, 14 years, well, since 2005, so we're approaching 15 seasons now. And I have that luxury of seeing habitat improvements around the country and how effective they have been or not. I want to go through a list, the top 10, and maybe we'll even throw a bonus in there for 11, but I want to go through the list of whitetail habitat improvements that I've seen and the mistakes that I've seen, those top 11, 10, 11 mistakes that I want to try to keep you from making this year and beyond. First one, large ponds. I love large ponds for fishing and swimming, but let's not get confused with fishing and swimming in the fact that you need a large pond on your land to attract whitetails. Whitetails do not need a large pond. They don't need a large swamp. They don't need a large waterway. In fact, when you have large waterways, rivers, creeks, then it diminishes the value of you being able to put a small water hole to define deer movement and to offer a great hunting stand location. And so those major water holes, those major ponds, awesome to have on your land. I am not saying not to make them, but that's fishing, swimming, not necessarily what whitetails need. And so that's a mistake I've seen some landowners make, where literally they were making them for the whitetails, and maybe you've made those out there under the recommendation of whoever, that you make this giant pond. And they're great for fishing and swimming, but whitetails do not need a giant pond. Really focus on smaller is better, precision is better, and defined movement is better as it relates to exactly where you want those water holes to be so that you can sit over them with a bow. If you can't shoot them with a bow, then it's not a great water hole. It's number one, and these are not in any order of importance or priority. Number two, something I'm very passionate about, and I see this on small parcels, is girdling or hack and squirt projects, where you're actually killing the standing timber to take canopy away to promote regeneration underneath. Sounds like a great practice. On small properties, it typically is not. And I'll give you a few examples. I had one of my clients, Frank, in Lower Michigan. He had a giant aspen almost fall on his head while he's working on his tractor because he had some 2-year-old cuttings on there of popple, some girdling, that were dying over a 2 to 4 year period, and they're starting to fall down. Well, not only did Frank almost have one drop on his head while he's using his tractor in a small plot adjacent to that, but at the same time, because of those falling aspen in that garbaged up, junky area, the deer were completely avoiding the area. Now I'm sure they browsed around the edge because the aspen regeneration was outstanding, but on a 40-acre parcel, you just can't afford to take an acre and exit off for the entire year for deer to not use, whether that area is 2 acres, an acre, whatever it might be, not to mention the danger associated with it. Another thing that I've seen is hack and squirt, where you're cutting the tree and you're squirting a chemical into that to keep it from growing. Oftentimes land managers are squirting the wrong trees. oak management, hardwood management is not necessarily a good thing as it relates to whitetails and wildlife. That's a separate thing. There's timber management and there's whitetail management. The two are not the same typically. They're quite a ways apart. Client in Wisconsin, red oak and aspen area. And in theory, it sounds good on paper. Let's improve the red oak mass. And we're going to kill all the aspen regeneration that's in there. We're going to hack and squirt it, cut it down. Now 5 years later, the landowner's he's left with a big park in that location, let's say 7-8 acres, where there's no understory, there's no briars, there's no brush, there's no regeneration. He's got a developed canopy of oak for higher mass production, and all the deer are living on his neighbors because he has no cover in that location. I'd rather see a diversity, I'd rather see a blend. Acorns are not that great of a food source during the hunting season as far as something you can define a movement on and that you could hold deer on every single year just because of those acorns. They're a part of the puzzle, they're a part of browse, they're a part of roughage, they're a part of hardwood regeneration. They're not a part of succulent, soft, high plentiful, high quality food sources that you can define a daily movement on every single afternoon. They're a great piece of the puzzle, but they're not overall a really good thing to have in giant monoculture areas of oak on your property or any other hardwood. In that hack and squirt, they were actually hacking and squirt, of course, the wrong tree. You wanted to promote that aspen regeneration. That's a prolific regeneration that's very important for these northern states, for whitetails, grouse, rabbits, very important species that was ruined. And I'll give you one more example of this, not necessarily hack and squirt or girdling, but I had a northern Wisconsin parcel that I visited, 160 acres. They had about 10 acres of aspen. The rest was primarily hard maple and a little bit of oak scattered in. Under the guise of a wildlife plan, the aspen was scarified during the summertime, where they go in with a dozer, they push all the aspen, they ruin the root systems off to the side in piles. They went back in that area and 700 to 800 hardwoods per acre. They tree tubed plantings in those locations to replace the aspen. And 5 years after that, planted the oaks and hardwoods at that time. Five years later, they're left with a bunch of dead trees and tubes. Some had grown a little bit. No wildlife in that area, no wildlife attraction. And with that killing of the aspen again, it was created, and those hardwoods were created for timber management and not ultimately for wildlife management. So on a small parcel, you can't afford to kill your aspen, kill your box elders, another very high quality wildlife and whitetail food, basswood, soft maple. Those are all high quality wildlife and whitetail materials that on a 40 acres you cannot afford to get rid of. We've even had, and I see this a lot in Northwest Illinois, Iowa area, where the hardwoods are harvested and then all the good wildlife trees, basically, again, going back to aspen, box elder, basswood, whatever it might be, even ash, those trees are cut, hacked and squirt, and then you have the dead debris laying in that big giant 30-acre cutting. We've had to go back into those cuttings with a backhoe, excavator, or bulldozer and open it back up so the wildlife could even move through it in the terms of whitetails, and use that and hopefully release some of the rootstock in the ground from those killed, actually high quality wildlife species. So we've seen this over and over again. These are a lot of remedies that I have to make on properties, and hack and squirt, girdling, killing trees that are actually wildlife trees on your property. You just cannot afford to make those mistakes in a small parcel. A lot of those practices do have their place, especially in large acreage public land holdings, commercial forestry practices. But when it gets down to 500 acres, 200 acres, and certainly 60, 40, 20, you just cannot afford to make some of those mistakes that you're promoting a high percentage of your land into timber management as opposed to wildlife management. Now, I've gone over this in another video when it talks about hinge cutting and hinge cut bedding areas, but deer bedding canopies, I want to hit this again. I've hit this many times, but a deer bedding canopy is never really a great activity to do on your land. It wastes a lot of time, and a lot of times you're taking material that you need for side cover and low cover and deer food regeneration during the day, and you're placing it up here into this canopy, making a canopy on a knoll. Now these deer have no cover and no food, and sure, they have a canopy, but again, they're not hiding from birds and planes. You can show me all the pictures you want of deer bedded under those in the shade, cool airflow during the summertime. But the dead of the deer season, November, October, December, those are the times it matters the most, and those canopies are taking food and regeneration and cover and side cover that is critical to whitetails and actually small game species too. I'll give you a quick example. 160-acre field, you have 5 acres of soft maple in the middle of that field. You take that outside edge and inside edge, you make a canopy or a trampoline effect. You can still see from one fence row to the other right through that pocket. Take that outside edge of that 5 acre little cluster of red maple, whatever it might be, hinge cut to the outside, and now you have that wall of protection around. You have regeneration towards the ground and about 3 feet high, which is what you should focus on for deer. And now you have food, cover, and the deer can't see you walking up to them within 20, 30, 40 yards. That's actually a bedding area. So please really look at eliminating those canopies. There's too much information online out there about creating those, and sometimes people get confused, and certainly a lot of my clients have created those, and then I go in there on several hundred clients and see that they're just not that effective. And if they are effective, it's because they're creating cuttings, they're taking canopy down, they're putting the ends of the tops and debris and the logs on the ground. A lot of times they cave in eventually, and 6, 7 years later they're highly effective. But again, deer don't need those canopies to bed, and if deer needed those canopies to bed around the country, there'd be a whole lot of deer that couldn't ever bed, because most of the time they don't have those canopies available. And what they really need is that side cover and browse. Now, number 4, hardwood plantings. Hardwood plantings in general are not a really important property or component on your property. Soft maple, basswood, box elder, ash, elm, brush, even autumn olive you can throw into that mix, and garbage, and red osier dogwood, high stem count, tag alder, willow, brush, fields, early successional growth, red cedar. Those are all quality whitetail and wildlife components. Hardwoods are not. Hardwoods are some of the hardest properties that I go to incorporate into a whitetail management plan and design, not because you can't make the plan. It's like an empty canvas. It's kind of nice to go in there and you can just say, there's a food plot here based on access. Here's a bedding area we can create here. But the amount of work needed to convert a stand of hardwoods into high quality whitetail habitat and wildlife habitat is significant. I look at a lot of properties online, even for sale, around in this location, Southwest Wisconsin. And if I can't get a property that has a diversity of habitat on it, if I'm looking at properties that are exceptional sized parcels along with a great cabin, but they're all hardwood, to me they're useless for whitetails. I wouldn't even touch them, because it's going to take too much work to put food plots into them, create diversity of habitat, and ultimately have the best whitetail parcel in the neighborhood. If it's all hardwood, I'd really try to avoid that. And if it's on your own location, you know, again, I'll go back to some of those hardwood cuttings where they're cutting the hardwoods and then they're hacking and squirting the good wildlife species, and then they're tree tubing 700 to 800 trees per acre of hardwood in that same area to regenerate the hardwood and to grow the hardwood after they cut it. And folks, that is a very bad practice. If you have a forester recommending that, think in terms of wildlife restoration or timber production. They are not one and the same, and they can be blended. I consult with clients all the time that we're looking at select cut portions of the majority of the property for continued timber management, fit within a whitetail parcel that includes clear cut bedding areas, conifer introduction in some areas for diversity, and then of course travel corridors and bedding areas in between. So not one and the same. Really look at, if you're being really instructed or recommended to plant hardwoods, look at the focus. Are you actually raising timber or are you raising whitetails? There's a big difference. And number 5, when it comes to overall cover, red cedar, autumn olive, tag alder, switchgrass, conifer plantings, pine plantations, spruce plantations. Those are all forms of base cover that you need for whitetails. Base cover meaning that's that heavy screening side cover thermal protection, and that's what creates that opportunity for deer to bed within. For example, if we had switchgrass in this field behind me and it's 7 feet tall, now we can actually create diversity pockets in there. We can take out 40% of that switchgrass potential area. We can create early successional growth pockets that we can kill the grass, any other kind of grass, because if it's not switchgrass, then it's not whitetail or wildlife grass as it relates to standing up all winter long and promoting a sustainable mix of diversity that can actually form a base cover. That base cover of red cedar, if I had red cedar all behind me right here, instead of removing that entire red cedar block, which is a terrible practice, we can go in there and remove 40 to 60% in pockets of red cedar, kill out the potential red cedar, kill out the grass, kill out any form of base bedding potential and cover that's coming in there, allow those broadleaf weeds and shrubs and hardwood regeneration to take place within pockets within that 40 to 60% that's been cut out. And now you have that perfect blend of red cedar base cover with bedding pockets within. Very, very important. You can do the same in autumn olive, you can do the same in switchgrass, and you're using that base cover, whatever it might be, to actually form that high quality bedding mix and whitetail and wildlife attraction on the inside. I've seen red cedar plantations or big, huge blocks of red cedar where they've been completely removed, and then again hardwoods were planted in their place. And it was such a missed opportunity where you could have had the red cedar, could have killed any future red cedar potential growing within those pockets, and you could have used the red cedar as that base and then use diversity pockets within, even 60 or 70% within that red cedar. Instead, the hardwoods sit there, and they sit there, and they sit there. And then when they do come in, there's no wildlife attraction, there's no wildlife potential, and if it's just a few acorns, it's not really helping you that much in that location. So think about those base forms of cover, whatever it might be, creating those diversity pockets within, not wasting that base structure of bedding, and looking at, even if you have a pine plantation or switchgrass, the great thing about switchgrass is within 1 year in some locations and up to 2 years in others, you can have that base bedding mix, create those pockets within, and you have instant, extremely high quality bedding. Can you imagine out in these fields with this little roll, you have 6, 7 foot high switchgrass in 2 years, and then you have 40 to 60% in pockets on the inside that's all protected and surrounded by that switchgrass, where you have early successional growth in the form of, could be box elder, soft maple, hardwood regeneration, shrub regeneration, could be goldenrod, ragweed, whatever it might be, briars. You're getting rid of the grass in there, and you're allowing that broadleaf shrub tip and woody regeneration to take place and provide food. And now this field behind me could just be an incredible explosion of wildlife and whitetail potential in 2 years or less, often just in 1 year. Now, one of the 6 mistakes I see often is that in the north 12 to 15 states of whitetail hunting and whitetail habitat improvement, which, let's face it, that covers, you know, the majority. I'm not saying Texas and in the southeast there's not a lot of deer hunters, but there's an awful lot of deer hunters across Minnesota, Michigan, all the way over into Pennsylvania, New York, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. And in those locations, native grass plantings, where you have a combination of switchgrass, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, is not often a great habitat improvement for your land, simply for the fact that when you need that cover the most, in December, late November, into January, February, that grass is laying down, covered with snow, offers no protection to small game and whitetails, and you cannot even promote a sustainable population of pheasant and small game within those areas because they have to leave those entire areas. I was in Minnesota a couple years ago, 20-acre field down by a river, flanked by hardwoods, and we're out there standing on top of snow and smashed down native grass planting of CRP, and there was literally no cover for any animals or critters in that entire field, and what an extreme waste. The landowners wanted that field purely for wildlife. They have CRP and they have a mix of grasses planted in there through a state program, and then years later they're locked into that program, and it's an area that does not promote a sustainable population of wildlife, because of the native grasses. And the reason why, just because you have big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, whatever it might be within that mix, that doesn't mean there's diversity. Grass is grass. Hardwoods are hardwoods. It's all the same. And so the only way you can promote diversity in there, to me, is for one, you have to have that base cover. That base cover can be switchgrass. That's the only grass that's good for whitetails in the northern states, because it's the only grass that's going to stand up and withstand, or have the best potential to withstand all winter long and all that snow. And so now deer can hide within in that location. Wildlife can live within that. But they're not going to like just pure switchgrass. So in a 20-acre field like that, again, what I just talked about behind me, putting that switchgrass in because it's going to be pure cover within 1 to 2 years, and then creating those diversity pockets within, even plantings, but non-grass areas, so that you have a food component and a daytime browse component. Now you have that edge that birds need, that pheasants need, rabbits, whitetails, and now you have that perfect combination. Now you can have sustainable wildlife populations. And I've seen areas of 2 acres of mixed switchgrass, solid pockets, and early successional growth that have pheasants in them, where thousands of acres around hardly have a pheasant in those fields, just because you don't have that grass that's standing up all winter long. And those switchgrass plantings are incredible. Native grass in those combinations, a lot of times they are not effective. And that's why you have pheasant planting operations every single spring and summertime in those areas, because you plant this mix that's for pheasants, quote, mix for pheasants, and then it's laying down all winter time. And because there's no sustainable population, you have to reintroduce pheasants every single year. And if they had those solid blocks of switchgrass in there, checkerboard, whatever it might be, then you could actually promote a sustainable pheasant population. And if you planted that native grass, what's really cool on social media every single year, and it seems to be more and more, same with girdling and hack and squirt, looks really cool to throw some pictures out there of a field being burned. And unfortunately, you have the same a lot of times, and I'm not saying this isn't effective down in southern Missouri, Iowa, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, across some southern areas where actually native grass plantings do hold true all winter long. But a lot of northern areas are burning those areas, and you're just creating more native grasses, and you're creating another ineffective habitat improvement on your land, and you're just continuing the never-ending cycle of non-sustainable wildlife populations within that native grass. And boy, but it looks really cool on social media. I can admit that some of those Instagram pictures of fire going across and that line and people working on it, but then you think back, boy, this is central Minnesota, and that field's not doing any good for wildlife. Maybe some nesting birds during the summertime, maybe a little bit of rabbit during the summertime, but if it's laying down in the summer or in the wintertime, then folks, it's ineffective. Now number seven, and one of the top 11 mistakes, but number 7 is a big one. You're gonna see me harp on this all the time. I just did in the last video we shot today, and I can't help it, but hunter pressured food plots are one of the worst habitat improvements you can make on your land, and I see this pattern repeated on almost every land I visit across the entire country, all 800 plus of the lands I've been to in the last 15 seasons. And those hunter pressured food plots on your land, they're doing way more harm than good. Just because you give some food to the deer herd during the summertime and give them a little bit of extra food, in theory, let's say you put on a few more pounds of weight, a couple more inches of antler because you had high quality foods. If those bucks are dead during the hunting season because you push them off your land to someone else and you're trying to grow those small bucks, I like a good saying, healthy dead bucks don't grow either. It doesn't matter how healthy they are going into the hunting season. If you're pushing them off, you're overpressuring that deer herd, then you're creating a nocturnal herd, and you're doing a lot more harm to your property and your herd than good, and certainly your hunting. It takes years of repeated patterns to see that. So you can always hide your food plots. I love food plots. I love hiding food plots. I like hiding my access to hunt those food plots if I do. I like hunting food plots with a gun from a distance, or with a bow if they're a pass-through plot to a bigger plot or a bigger food source where I know that I'm not going to spook deer. Bottom line, if you're setting yourself up to spook deer when you go hunt those food plots, then you're setting yourself up for failure before the season even begins. I have lots of videos on that, and I encourage you to take a strong, really hard look at that going into this hunting season, and that's number 7 on the list, but it could have been number 1. Now, number 8, this is something we just created a video on, but water holes are some of my favorite improvements. That's right up there with one of those highly effective improvements. I love it because deer are encouraged to stop at this water hole and drink for just a couple minutes, and then they're on to a food source. If that water hole is in a food plot or in a food source, then you're missing a golden opportunity. For one, you probably shouldn't be hunting that food plot in the first place if you're setting yourself up to spook deer. But 2, you're missing a great opportunity to offer precision and defined movements to that water hole from dry bedding areas and then to the food source. So you're missing that opportunity to glue and hold that movement together, and you're missing the opportunity for a golden opportunity for a precision bow hunting spot in the woods, back in the cover, that you can access with a particular wind, knowing deer that are coming from a particular dry bedding area and then heading to food. So keeping those water holes out of food plots is a great idea. The deer are already going to the food plot. You don't need to add to that attraction. Keep that water hole back in the woods and make sure that you can enter and access that water hole without spooking any deer on the food source. So people say, how close should I have that water hole? Well, if you can still spook deer off the food plot when you're getting in and out, then you need to move it further away. So that's a big test. Just always think, if deer had guns, could you get in and out of that stand without them seeing you? And I think we need to look at it that way a lot more. People would hunt a lot different, they'd access their stands a lot different, and truly that comes into play when you're hunting your water holes and you're accessing your water holes, and as it relates to those food source movements. Now, number 9 is kind of interesting. It's an oversaturation of water holes and mock scrapes. And so I love water holes, typically on a 40-acre parcel. If it's in a dry area, and especially if you have some good elevation change, then you might be able to have 3 water holes, maybe 4 at the most. On 80 acres, that might translate into 4 or 5. On 200 acres, you might have 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8, depending on if there's good elevation change and the deer are really separated. Mock scrapes, it's an appropriate amount. Normally I have 8 or 9 tree stands on a 40-acre parcel, maybe 10 to 12 on 80 acres. You might have 14, 15, 16 on 200 acres. And so I encourage you to have about 1 mock scrape for every tree stand. And so when you have those tree stands on your land and you're looking at that number of 8 or 9 on 40 acres up to 13, 15, 18 on 200 acres, whatever it might be, that's a good amount of mock scrapes. And the problem with having too much is that you lower the value of each one the more that you add. So imagine if you have 10 water holes on 40 acres, well, which one do deer go to? They can go to any of them. So you're not really promoting any kind of movement. It's random, and the power of one is greatly, greatly diminished. I've actually literally, I'm not joking, I've seen 500 mock scrapes on a 200-acre parcel in northern Wisconsin. And as you can imagine, those mock scrapes, most of them were not used at all, hardly any of them. A small percentage were used a very little bit. In that case, they'd actually use some chemical treated posts, and so the deer didn't like them anyways. They didn't like the smell around them. But way oversaturated. I've seen a recommendation of making mock scrapes around all your access trails. Well, now you're just encouraging bucks to enter your access trails, and then you spook them off, in theory, going back and forth. But again, the oversaturation of mock scrapes, water holes, very critical that you keep that number down to where it's an effective number, and you still have that balance where each one of your improvements is high quality. You can put a trail camera on it. You can encourage movement by stand locations. You can use mock scrapes and water holes, and then really cement and glue that movement between bedding area and food source and on those travel corridors you're trying to make. They are highly effective, but not as adding too many. And if you increase and you run over that balance and you put too many in your property, the power of one is just diminished, and they're not going to be a very effective habitat improvement on your land. Now, number 10, this is something that I run into, and you can imagine, I go to a property, they're excited to have me come there, and a lot of times they say, oh, I don't think you're going to like my shooting house. And I've literally seen shooting houses that were in the $8,000 to $10,000 range to make. The stairways, the 3-flight stairway, the actual shack itself, or the table, poker table, fold down cot. You can imagine how much wood and how much scaffolding it takes to put some of those in place, and they are not movable. And so a lot of my clients know before I get there that they're really worried about that improvement. And of course we try to work around it. But the bottom line is, if your blinds and your improvements for hunting those shacks on your land, if they don't pass the 100-yard test, then they should be hidden more or moved. And that's pretty definite, because again, it all goes back to, you don't want to spook deer. The 100-yard test is if you can still see that blind from 100 yards during November and October with that foliage on the tree still, then it needs to be moved, or it needs to be thickened up or brushed in better, a lot better. Deer don't like those boxes. Everyone knows mature bucks are coming in and they're looking at those small trail cameras on the side of a tree, and they'll stare at it, and then that's the only picture you get of that buck. It happens all the time. This is this box of a trail camera. Imagine 6x6, 8x8. It's lifted up even worse. So imagine those bucks that are coming from another property. They're not used to that improvement anyways. They're not used to that trail camera in that location, let alone that box blind. They come in late October. They're coming through during the rut. They see that during the daylight, they run, and you're not going to get them back, folks. And so if your blinds are not passing that 100-yard test, then I really encourage you to brush them in, lower them. And that's another thing too. You get to the side of a food plot, you've gotten there successfully, you've accessed, and now you're climbing up 12 feet of scaffolding, getting into the blind and saying hello to every deer that's out there when you get down or up in that blind, and you're spooking those deer. Now this is my bonus one, and this one might ruffle, so I think I've already ruffled enough feathers with the first 10, but conservation reserve enhancement programs, CREP programs, MFL programs, they all have their place. But a lot of times the land that you're enrolling into those programs, you're severely handicapping yourself. In the case of the CREP program, I've seen programs that literally they're locked in and they're never going away, and the landowner has very little that they can do with those areas in terms of food plots, plantings. I've even seen to the point where a CREP program administrator, federal program at least, they're driving by on a road, they look down on my client's property and see that they have ATV trails going through there on the land they just bought and purchased. And the ATV trails were from the previous landowners, and they're informed that they can't use those ATV trails through that area. And of course, you know, you can say that those people knew when they signed up, they're getting a huge tax break. I encourage you to make all your improvements first before enrolling in any program, and that also goes along with the MFL program. So I'm looking at land right now, I'm looking at land to purchase, and if I can't make that percentage of improvement that I want on the land, then that MFL program, no matter how much that I can save in my taxes, is not a great program, and it's not a great parcel for me to buy. Always make your whitetail habitat improvements first, and then enroll into the program. It's a great savings on your taxes, especially when it relates to managed forest law in Wisconsin and other states, where you can enroll your property into a timber enhancement improvement program. But if you've made those improvements first, if you've carved out your bedding areas, your water holes, your food plots, your access, and you've diversified the timber, then it's a great opportunity to enroll in those programs, take that tax advantage at that time. But boy, if I'm looking at a parcel that's 80 acres of hardwoods, for one, I wouldn't buy it because there's not enough diversity anyways, and it's a poor wildlife value. But two, if it's enrolled in MFL, then it's a no-brainer. I'd run like the wind. I wouldn't touch it, because I can't then go in and make those improvements that I want to on that land. I'm not saying you can't make improvements. I'm not saying you can't work within the 10% open ground that you can make food plots in, or work on the timber. I've known of a lot of timber enhancement improvement and administrators that are very flexible and allow landowners. We have some really good ones here in Southwest Wisconsin, by the way. But it's very important that you make sure what you're getting yourself into, because a lot of those programs are purely boards per foot programs, or they're set aside land for wildlife and waterfowl, and they might not meet your whitetail objectives, and they might not offer the flexibility, and a lot of times they don't offer that flexibility to make changes that are appropriate for your land after you've enrolled them. Now, I know I'll ruffle some feathers with this list of 11 here. There's a lot of tried and true practices in there that all have their place, or habitat improvements, whitetail habitat improvements. There's some that are just more fads and myths and should never be attempted. I love this stuff. And again, I'm not trying to pick apart these things. And what I'm really, my main objective with this list is I want to help you, keep you from making mistakes. A lot of these mistakes, if you make them on your land, can have an effect on your land and your objectives, your goals for decades to come, let alone years to come or this season. I hope these make some sense. I hope you can look through your own land, take some of your planning out. You know, in a lot of these things, if you're not doing them, then you're actually making life a lot easier on yourself. You're not spending as many resources. You're saving future resources of time and money, and that's what it's all about. I want you to make effective improvements on your land. Again, I love doing this, love doing what I do. I just want to help, and I hope you have a great off season this year and going into the hunting season this season. There's a lot of things you can do to turn around your property right now and maybe correct some of these mistakes that have been made on your property, and I hope it brings to light some of them that have already been made on your property. Good luck this season, and I appreciate you watching.